Now, we all know that Steven Miles is, fingers crossed, headed for the political wood chipper towards the end of the year. But let's be honest, the Queensland Labor Party is good at changing the subject. They've won elections they definitely shouldn't have. But certainly, when you look at the West Ipswich by-election and plenty of others, there are people, no matter how desperate he looks with his Queensland Maroons hat on, they just walk past him. No, I'm not voting Labor. I'm not voting. No, bugger off, mate. Not interested. So he's doing everything he possibly can to somehow pull this one out of the fire. And he thinks that he's going to be able to do what they weren't able to do in Canberra, and that's call the supermarkets of Australia to order. That he will be able to single-handedly prove in a hand-selected committee dominated by the Labor Party in the Queensland Parliament what they weren't able to do in Canberra. Now, remember when it was in Canberra, the CEOs of Woolies and Coles, they got a tongue-lashing from the Greens, swearing and everything. Reality, of course, nothing changes, nothing will change, but they all had their little moment in the sun. And so it was, the inquiry was there in Brisbane today. Now, Steven Miles was all fired up and ready to go because they were going to finally put the sword to these evil, evil supermarkets.
Queenslanders would like to hear is a supermarket boss say, we could have done better.
And that's the weirdest part. He's on the committee. Now, normally, parliamentary committees are backbenchers when it comes to the opposition, shadow ministers, but essentially the Premier or the Minister doesn't sit on the panel, but because he wants the whole background on the 6 p.m. news of him sitting there in the Parliament waving his fingers at the CEOs, that somehow magically the people of Queensland will work out, oh, he's on our side because, you know, he wears the Maroons cap. Seriously. Now, as for the actual bosses of the supermarkets, they've told him to go jump. None of the CEOs are willing to sit there and go through the tongue lashing that happened at the federal, so they've actually sent a whole bunch of underlings. But of course, the fact that the CEO of Coles and Woolies wasn't there to be finger waved at by Giggles, he's very annoyed.
What we've seen from the supermarkets is they just don't seem to get it. They just don't seem to get how the impact of their prices and their practices are hurting Queensland households and hurting Queensland farmers. In particular, Coles is thumbing their nose at Queenslanders, thumbing their nose at the Queensland Parliament.
Just a quick mental note. Think about his comments there about Coles, that particularly Coles is causing trouble for people. Just put a pin in it. As for who's actually representing the supermarkets, they've got high-ranking people who are based in Queensland that are turning up in front of it. The supermarket giants have elected to send senior staff with government and industry relations people, the head of public affairs that were there on the behalf of Coles, the chief commercial officer and the Queensland director of Woolies were the ones that were sitting down. So there were people that were willing to cop the tongue lashing, but it's not as sexy as yelling at the CEOs. But interestingly, another person who was on the inquiry today is the Shadow Agriculture Minister. The Shadow Agriculture Minister is Tony Perrott. I had to double check his name. And he was there asking questions, but he was booted out of the inquiry that Steven Miles is sitting on as well, that's dominated by the Labor Party in the lower house, and it is again a show trial because he tried to introduce a photo today. Before I show you the photo, he was told he wasn't allowed to do it. That was therefore ruled disorderly. Therefore, he was booted out of the room. You cannot ask any more questions for at least 60 minutes. Why? Because the photo was this photo. The photo of the bloke who said what about Coles? This photo's not from 5 years ago. It ain't from 5 weeks ago. It's barely from 5 days ago. This was when he was at Beef Week last week in Rockhampton, and he's cooking up a storm with a bunch of school kids at an event sponsored by Coles. Now, for food safety, maybe he had to wear the hat. Perhaps he could have turned it around, though. But can you believe that the show trial is so thin in its political objectives that someone trying to introduce a photo that kind of contradicts the I hate Coles of Steven Miles is booted out of the committee for a full hour. Oh, yeah. They're committed to the big issues, aren't they, the Miles government? Now, whether you go to Coles, Woolies, Aldi, IGA or whatever corner store, can you do me a favour? And I did say this 4 years ago, but I'm going to say it again now. Even though the cost of that item probably is more than it was 4 years ago, can you get some disinfectant? Because we're going to need it after we get rid of this mob towards the end of the year in Queensland. It's up to you, Queensland. I made the case before, it didn't work. But I reckon the case is going to land hard in the form of Queenslanders with a size 9 funk into the backside of this bloke and all of the other fools that are with him.